There's Stephen Friedlich, tape number 4. How long were you in this Swedish safe house? And the dates, please?
It probably was a better part of 2 months.
The dates?
Around mid-November to early January, when we were taken off to the ghetto.
What did you do every day there?
The events of the day was first getting up, and by that time we were about 10 to 15 people in a room sleeping, one bathroom. Consequently, by the time everybody got finished with the bathroom, half the day was gone. And generally try to find kids of my age to talk with, help in distributing the food to everybody else, see if there were some older people in the building that needed assistance and help. It's again where the Boy Scout training comes in, and the ideas of helping those who cannot help themselves worked, and try to adjudicate problems between people who felt that they needed more food, less food, and there was only a very limited amount. And plus playing cards or playing chess. There were a lot of kids of my age in the building who played both chess and cards, and we honed our skills in both to become perfect, which eventually then stood me in good stead in university, just in case I had to earn a bit of pocket money the hard way.
About how many people were in that place?
There were probably between 400 and 500 people in the building, I imagine. It's very hard to keep track because I don't think that a list as such has existed, or at least not in our hands. But there were 5, 6 stories, a big courtyard, a bunch of apartments off the courtyard, and every apartment was just chock-a-block full of people, as many as they could squeeze in.
Were they all Jews?
They were all Jews, and they were all who supposedly were under Swedish protection.
And what happened next?
And then, of course, yeah, food was delivered daily, and we distributed. Next, as I said before, we were early January, marched under Arrow Cross, a so-called protection into the Budapest ghetto. And then we knew that if we thought we were in trouble until now, it's going to get worse. In the ghetto, everybody was assigned to certain buildings that was already brimming full of people. We were put into a building called Veselényi utca. It's W-E-S whatever. And we were on the 4th or the 5th floor, squeezed into a room.
Who was with you?
It was my grandparents from both sides, my parents, my brother, plus some strangers that got squeezed in with us. I mean, strangers that they were not part of the family, but we did know actually some of them. And their life became a lot simpler because food was basically non-existent. So you only had what you could scavenge, and the only one who was allowed or who was brave enough to leave the building was my brother Tom, who at the age of 10 was the main food supplier of our family, simply because if anybody of an older age would wander on the street, he would take a chance that either a drunken Hungarian or German or whatever Nazi would just either pick him off or shoot him, or worse things that can happen. And there was a Jewish community kitchen in the ghetto that supplied soup and other types of food, and each day he would lug a big container with some food for a family, which we tried to divide as well as we could. And of course, we were up on the 4th floor, and water already was not running because the water pumps were shut down due to wartime bombing and damage. So the only place where you could get any water was in the basement, where the force of the Danube put enough water pressure in the pipes. There was a bit of a trickle coming out of the pipes. So each day, all of us had to go down, bring up dishes, so that we have or water to drink, and maybe to flush the toilets every so often, which we had to do it very frugally. And whenever we did try to cook. Of course, cooking was a very complicated enterprise because there was no natural gas or electricity in the building. But there were some gas or some wood-fired stoves from the old days left over, which we have reactivated and broke up all the furniture in the apartment, chairs, cupboards, whatever we could find, to turn it into firewood, so that we can have a bit of heat where we can make maybe coffee or tea or just warm water or some kind of a warm soup. And what I really remember that we were constantly hungry. And however, physically we were not hurt. The only thing that I want to backtrack in the Swedish houses, that the Swedish house was given a work quota, that each day you had to produce so many able-bodied men to go out and help the Germans unload freight cars at the railroad station. And we were afraid to go out in those groups because every so often a few people wouldn't come back, and there were days when none of them come back. But I was put in some of those details. However, luckily, I made it back every day. And in the ghetto, we didn't have to worry about how to fill the day because there was nothing to do. You couldn't leave even the room. And we slept so many people that we were like sardines on the floor, on maybe a blanket or a piece of cloth or something. And in utter misery, being filthier and filthier as the days go by. And I remember one particular incident when a lady who was with us in the room, I can't recall her name, decided that this is enough. She can't stand being dirty. She went down the basement, brought up a dish of water, put it down on the floor in the middle of the room, stripped from the waist to wash herself. And as she bent down, a Russian Rata aircraft machine gunned the building. And the bullet came flying in through the window and hit her in the buttocks. And of course, it broke out the window. And we were all quite scared. And there we were with glass pieces all over the place. And this poor woman, there were a couple of doctors in the building who managed to do the best for her that they could without any real instrument. And I don't really know what happened after, but we were so scared that we decided this is the time we better go down to the shelter downstairs anyway. And we did go down, and it's just another manifestation of the miraculous hand of God or faith or whatever you may call them, that within less than 24 hours, a Russian mortar shell hit the building into that room, and everything that was in that room was shredded. So had this bullet not come in and hit the woman, we would have all been there, and I wouldn't be telling you that story today. So there was the ghetto. Now, on, when was that? January the 18th, we were liberated by the Russians, which also is a very interesting incident, how stupid and invincible kids think they are. Because I remember we were at a second or third floor window, looking out the window. I mean, we could hear the firing coming closer and closer to where we are. And as we looked out, we could see around one corner a group of Russian soldiers, and down the block around another corner, a couple of German soldiers with machine guns shooting at each other. And we were just up on the second floor window watching those two. And eventually, the Russians, who were, I must tell you, quite brave, because what they did one Russian soldier ran out in the middle of the road, firing a submachine gun at the Germans until he dropped. Then the next one, and the next one, until one of the Russians killed all the Germans, and then the Russians advanced. I mean, either they were drunk or had no fear. And then the Russians liberated us. The first thing they did, they took everybody's watches, because they collected watches. They had a habit of liking watches because they made tick-tock, but most of them have never seen a watch before. In fact, the troops who took over the part of the city that we were in must have been deep from the Ural Mountains, who have neither seen bathrooms, watches, or many of the other things. And there were some very amusing incidents that after a Russian walked around with half a dozen watches strapped to their arm, they stopped somebody in the street. If they had a watch that worked, they gave him half a dozen watches that stopped working for the one that did work, even though that the ones that they gave him could have been gold or silver or what have you. So anyway, here was liberation.
How did you feel when you were liberated?
Well, we felt elated. We thought that our life was saved, which in fact it did, because we found out that the Germans had some very sinister plans for the ghetto to try to blow up everybody in there before they go on. And the first step was that we went back to my grandparents', my mother's parents' apartment, where of course all the windows were blown out. And we tried to put our life together. Now, the incidents that I remember at that place was a couple. One, of course, there were no windows, but we found some wrapping papers to make windows from. And at night, because there were no electricity, no lights, we had some little tins where we had some cooking oil that we made lanterns out of, and as a wick, we would use shoelaces from shoes that we found and cut them up into little pieces, put the shoelace through a cork, and make a lantern out of it. For food, we were quite lucky because my grandmother had a cheese, butter, and similar variety store in the building that they lived in. That was her business before the war. And when the Germans came in, she hid a lot of the cans and a lot of the perishable food in a large case behind the store. That was an old, ugly-looking wooden case covered with a lot of rubbish that survived the war. Nobody bothered to look at it, what was in there. And when we came back, we went there, and we had enough food for maybe a few days. And that was our first sort of shot of food.
Which grandmother was that?
That was the grandmother Mandel, the parents of my mothers. And then there were other amusing incidents. There was a wine cellar across the road, and we knew that my grandfather liked to have a little drink every so often. And we heard that the Russians are raiding the wine cellar. So we went over with water buckets, and the Russians went down the row of barrels, and with the submachine gun shot holes in the barrels. And as the wine was flowing out, we picked it up in water buckets and took it back at the apartment and filled up half the bathtub with wine. Of course, it wasn't all one brand, it was probably a mixture. And then, of course, food was still quite short in Budapest. So we had to cope with the next set of occupiers who did not pick on you because you were Jewish, but picked on you because you were a member of an elite class or a bourgeois or somebody who was a bit better than a working class. So to begin with, our first concern was food, and to see where we get food from and how we do. So my father and one of his friends went down to the countryside on one of the freight trains to scavenge for food. And they traveled maybe 100 kilometers outside Budapest, where the farmland was basically untouched by the war. Food was plentiful, but money was not accepted. So he took down some trade goods like textiles and other things to trade with the peasants for food. And he brought back some of that food with him to Budapest. And one of the amusing incidents is that I remember that he bought a goose from the farmer that was supposed to be fattened up, so that when I go down in a couple of weeks, they'll slaughter it, and then I bring back the goose with me to Budapest. And a few weeks later, my cousin, George, who now lives in Budapest.
His last name?
His last name is Steiner. Went out to the railroad station, hopped on a freight train, went down station by station. Most of the time we traveled on top of the freight cars or in one of the little cabins that the brakeman has at the end of the freight train. And we went down in the countryside. Now also you must know that after the war, the country was basically destroyed, and the Russians kept picking people at random for a little work. So we got taken off the train every so often for a little work, and then we worked maybe half an hour, and we found a way to escape, and back on the train, off the train again. And mind you, on that topic, when the Russians occupied Budapest, they apparently had a quota to fill for prisoners of war. And we found out that the Russians, as they were advancing, didn't really bother with taking any prisoners of war. Anybody who was behind the front lines were just left to their own devices. Once the front was consolidated, they knew that they had to round up so many men between the ages of 16 and whatever, and ship them off to Siberia. So I got picked up twice in Budapest to be put on that transport. And once I was marching in a column where they had a Russian soldier at the back and a Hungarian soldier at the front, marching us toward the railroad station. And when I saw on the side of the road a big billboard, I picked a moment when I felt that the Russian at the back wasn't watching. I just left the column, hid behind that billboard, and the rest of them probably never came back, or at least not for many years. And the second time I got picked up, they were getting smarter, and they put us on trucks. And they took us to an airfield just outside Budapest to rehabilitate the airfield that was damaged by bombing before they ship everybody further. And from that group, they asked some people to go and clean up a house where one of the Russian officers was living. So I volunteered for that work detail, went to the house. They sent me out to cut up some wood outside for firewood, went outside and started to walk away. When the Russian soldier saw that I was walking away, he fired his submachine gun in the air to frighten me, so I stopped. And then he got me, and then he beat me up a bit. And then I continued working until nightfall. And at night I tried again, and this time I made it, and I got back to Budapest. So again, somehow, between the paramilitary training that we got in high school and the Boy Scout training that I got, it certainly was a strong contributing factor of staying alive. Now, getting back to the food and the country, when I went down with my cousin to get food in the country, we went back to exactly the peasant that my father told me to go to, and he was very happy to see us. He even had a place for us to stay. And I remember the first day we arrived, we ate omelets out of a dozen eggs each because we were so hungry. I mean, we haven't seen eggs or solid food really for a long, long time. And then I asked him about the goose that my father bought, and he told me that, you know, little boy, a huge tragedy happened. Just a week before you came, that goose suddenly dropped dead, and I haven't got it anymore. But there's one other one that I can sell to you for an additional price. But anyway, we bought it and made it back to Budapest with the food, and then we tried to put our life together from there on.
Did your father go back to work?
Yes, my father went back to work, which was quite difficult because a lot of the sawmills were in pieces and they had to rehabilitate it. And it became to a political standoff between him and the government. Because the company was still there. All the employees who made it through the war trickled back, and they tried to get the sawmill going, which was basically operational. But they had to get timber cutting permits from the government to cut timber. So the government says, you're a Swiss company, bring back logs from Switzerland. The idea really was that they wanted to nationalize the company, but because it was a Swiss company, they could not, and they wanted to find a roundabout way to nationalize it. So therefore, about 6 months standoff, when my father says, okay, if we cannot get timber, we let people go. Well, if you let your employees go, you're an antisocial person who acts against the socialist government, and you'll be jailed. So he says, okay, then we pay them. So for 6 months, the employees walked around just sitting, playing cards, reading papers, and doing nothing, until eventually the government relented because they needed the railroad ties to rebuild the Hungarian railroads. And then they did get logs and started to work the operation. But that probably, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but that ties into my father leaving Hungary, because about a year and a half or 2 years down the line, somebody at the Ministry of Security had another bright idea, saying that maybe we can nationalize the company by arresting my father and beating him until he signs all the documentation that is necessary. So they had an arrest warrant against him for economic crimes. And what was the crime? He sabotaged the Hungarian national economy by purposely paying 600 people for 6 months not to work. The lucky part of that was that my father at that time was abroad in London, and he got tipped off by a very close friend of our family, so he never did return.
So you were alone with your mother?
But no, anyway, no, I mean, this was sort of jumping ahead. After the war, no, the family was together. Those who came back, except my 2 uncles, we resumed school again. School was basically catching up, and we graduated from high school in 1946 in Budapest, all the kids who survived the war.
Did you meet up with other survivors?
Yes, really our whole class of kids was basically survivors. Incidentally, our high school class was quite unique because about half, or maybe 60% was Jewish, 40% was not Jewish. And the interesting part was that during all the Holocaust and all those incidents, we did not experience any anti-Semitic or any discrimination from our classmates. At least none that I can remember. They were all there to help ourselves. In fact, one of my colleagues survived the war with the false papers given to him by one of the classmates.
What was his name?
His name is Dr. Kerene, who had one of his friend's papers for a while. So, where were we?
You graduated high school?
Yeah, graduated high school, and then, of course, I wanted to become an engineer and wanted to start university. It was very hard to get into a Hungarian university because I belonged to an origin that was the wrong class, the bourgeois class, and not the peasant and working class.
How did they classify you as a bourgeoisie?
Well, anybody whose father did not work as a tradesman or was a peasant, was a bourgeois. But luckily, through my father's connection, I was accepted into university in Switzerland. And in September 1946, which was a very, very emotional event, my parents put me onto a train to Switzerland, where I was an 18-year-old kid going out of the country legally with a passport as a student. But really, we didn't know if we'll ever see each other or not. And it must have been probably even harder for my parents than for myself, seeing this young kid go out into the world, not knowing if they'll ever see me. And in Switzerland, I attended university for a couple of years. My father, because of his foreign connection and doing business abroad, did manage to visit me a couple of times, but they would never let both my parents out of the country at the same time because they felt that they will not return. Consequently, it was either one or the other leaving the country. And the last time that we managed to be together and meet each other was in Carlsbad in 1948, summer 48, where they traveled supposedly for a holiday, and I traveled from Switzerland, again with my passport, supposedly on a holiday, and we met. And from there, I went back to Switzerland, and I was on my way to Canada.
When did you decide to travel to Canada, to emigrate to Canada?
Well, it wasn't a matter of a decision. The Hungarians announced that all student passports will be cancelled by the end of 48. So anybody who has not finished his studies must return to Hungary anyway for re-evaluation and new passport. And luckily, a friend of mine that I studied in Switzerland with had an uncle in Toronto who came to his uncle to school, and through him I was accepted to the University of Toronto and continued my studies in Toronto.
And what was that friend's name?
His name is Peter Monk.
And when did your parents, what did your parents decide to do?
Well, it wasn't a matter of decision. When the arrest warrant for my father came out in 47, I think it was 48, my father stayed behind in London. I mean, it was also a long story that I don't think I want to go in at this time, but he had a bodyguard with him who was responsible for him not escaping, and he had to slip away from his bodyguard. In the meantime, my mother, who got tipped off by him through a coded telephone conversation in Budapest, got my brother out of school, and as they were, my brother with his school books and my mother with her shopping basket, got on a train with a group of Zionist smugglers to the Czech border, walked across the border at night to Czechoslovakia, went to Bratislava, hid in an attic for a week until they were smuggled aboard a freight train and shoved over to Vienna, or to Austria, and they ended up in Vienna in 1948.
And when did they reunite with your father?
Eventually, my father found my mother in Vienna, but he could not go to Vienna because of travel restrictions. So again, my mother had to get some semi-legitimate travel papers, and they reunited in Salzburg in Austria.
And when did they come to Canada?
And they came to Canada in 1949, the spring of 1949.
We'll end this tape here.